such fundings or such guarantees provide outweigh the threats?
Okay, it's an irony that when the issue of this wave of sovereignty came up, it's now gotten into the mainstream, and everyone is throwing their own arguments on the table and debating it very aggressively. Some of the people are also giving the wrong interpretation. So let's take it in two parts. Number one is discussing the wave of sovereignty when you want to borrow. The simple definition of that is that if you borrow for a capital project such as railway or ICT infrastructure, the clause only states that if there's a default, you cannot claim to be a sovereign and not be called to account. You have to waive that sovereignty and deal with the matter and come to arbitration as required by the contract as a partner, not as a sovereign. So you're waiving your rights to claim that I am a sovereign, therefore I have sovereign immunity and I'm not answerable. No, you borrowed money to build infrastructure, so you're answerable. If you default, the infrastructure can be repossessed, and the lender can repossess it, manage it, and recoup. The good news for you is they cannot uproot the infrastructure from your territory, but they can repossess and take it over and run it profitably. Okay, so you can't claim to say I'm a sovereign and therefore I'm above the law, because as we know, some cases are there where the sovereign has immunity, such as you cannot arrest a diplomat in a foreign land, such as you cannot encroach on the territory of a country in a foreign land. So Nigeria can invoke its sovereignty and say, to hell with you, I'm not answering.
So what happened?
But no,
to address that?
You are. Okay, so let's get that right. Yeah, let's get that right. And that does not mean that you're losing or giving away your sovereignty as a country. No, it's just as it relates to that transaction. On the other hand, you talked about, can we apply this model to fund maritime infrastructure?
Okay.
The answer is yes and no. Yes, because if the maritime infrastructure that is at stake is really, really expensive, then absolutely, you can apply that model. An example would be the Warri, Itape, Ajokuta, Abuja rail line that is combined with the Warri Seaport. There is foreign loan attached to it in that concession, and there's a guarantee clause from the federal government for that foreign loan from China to the benefit of CRCC, that is the concessionaire. Okay? But then on the other hand, isn't it, we have the Lekki Deep Sea Port Project. NPA is a minority partner. And then you have a lot of foreign partners and Lagos State government. There's no guarantee there. No sovereign guarantee, no government guarantee of any sort. It's strictly a private sector driven project. So depending on the size of the project and how critical it is, government can step in and provide guarantee. But it's not in all cases, not in all cases that you will always have to resort to guarantees. No. We can't and we shouldn't abuse guarantees at all.
I understand what your law had called for government through NEMASA to provide guarantees for ship owners so that they can either have these vessels built, and brought in while they pay over time. Wouldn't that be a good way to handle it, given the problem we've had with getting these ships in place, which has lasted years?
Yes, the indigenous maritime sector hasn't really picked up as it ought to. Um, I do quite feel for the indigenous ship owners who would want government guarantees, either financial guarantees or guarantees of service that will generate proceeds. Of those two options, I would rather suggest that the indigenous ship owners are guaranteed a portion of the services. You can call it set asides. They have it all over the world. Even in the US, there are such clauses that set aside a portion of maritime, fleet, and freight and cargo set aside for the local industry. That is a little tricky because you have to realize that indigenous ship owners are privately owned entities. So how does government provide guarantees to private companies? It's tough. Central bank is doing a good job of almost acting not just as a lender of last resort, but the central bank is now acting as a development institution, such as Bank of Industry, Bank of Agriculture. Central bank has become very pivotal and very key in developing what you call sector, whether it's for agriculture, whether it's for ICT or Nollywood. Maybe in that regard, central bank can play a role in setting up an intervention fund for the maritime sector. I'm sure if the players come together, lobby hard, sensitize government enough, and CBN particularly, maybe there could be an intervention fund. But already, remember, isn't it, that there's the cabotage fund that is warehoused with the massa. What has happened to that money? Why is that fund not being deployed? And we've, for many years, over 10 years now, we have proposed a concept of using that fund as an intervention fund to create a private equity fund, create a maritime private equity fund, use that money to seed that private equity fund that will be privately run and wants to tap that fund, it can approach the entity, raise money as a portion of its own equity in the ship acquisition or whatever transaction that is required. Because unless you run that fund very, very efficiently on a commercial basis, it could be frittered away. I'm sure we've had this experience before. So the minister and those decision makers that are in charge do have that ambivalence. And if we bring out this money again, we don't know how the government is already overburdened. Who are you going to give guarantee and who will you not give guarantee? You give guarantee for power, you give guarantee for ports, you give guarantee for railway, you give guarantee for everybody will wake up and say, I need guarantees too. So it's a tricky
Sir. You
mentioned
the need for a portion of the cargo or services to be kept aside for indigenous players. And I have Madam Obiageliobi, the former DG Chamber of Shipping. She just asked a question to say how do you set aside in a situation when such operations? And now it brings me, sorry sir, it also brings me to the question, which should come before? Is it the vessel or the cargo? You know, which should really come before?
Cargo.
Okay.
The cargo. you know what they call, you can leverage
Yes.
cash flow. So if you can project that from a certain amount of cargo, I can generate X amount of money, I can use that contract to raise money and build a ship. That's the way it's done. If I can project my cash flow over the next 5 years, that if I had a service contract with an IOC or a set aside for a certain amount of service, I will generate X amount. I can use that documentation to develop my cash flow projection, develop my spreadsheet, all things being equal. I mean, other factors and other things that has to do with the corporate entity being equal. You can actually leverage that to raise money. You can use that as your down payment for a vessel. You can do a lot with it. So it's a catch-22 situation. If you don't have the set asides, you have to go look for money to build the vessels before you get the services or the contracts. But if there are contracts given to bona fide indigenous ship owners or operators, you can actually use that and leverage it to
In
raise
other
money
words, what
and
you're
get your
saying is
work
that there
done.
is need for government, maybe through NIMASA, through an MP, and 30% of all cargoes are reserved for indigenous players. And that once we do this, we open up the
You bet.
channel for inflow of money to build. Okay, all right, thank you. Madam Obiageli, I hope that actually
Yes.
answers the
Yes.
question, because she just asked another question. How do you get a contract without a vessel? He's saying that once you have, once government puts aside certain amount of a cargo for indigenous players, that
Yes.
the vessel will come.
Yes. Very correct. That is an incentive program. The
Okay.
incentive is in the set asides. Every country in the world players in a certain sector is a normal practice. And when you're creating that kind of incentive, you know that the vessels do not exist. Absolutely. We know they don't exist, but we know that the reason and the way that you can acquire those vessels is from your projected cash flow. But you have to statutorily encode that. Because if you don't have it encoded, then you can go beat yourself all around, go to the IOCs, go where they say, oh, no, if you don't have vessels, when you have vessels come, how are you going to get vessels? Do you know how much you have to invest in acquiring the vessels, then go bid for the project, for the contract? You can do the reverse engineering.
Yes.
You can do the reverse engineering, yes. And by the way, if you have those kind of opportunities, similar to local content act, right? It's the same way local content operates. In Bonny right now, as they talk about the expansion of this train 7 of LNG, it's all part of the package. There are discussions that are going on set asides for the indigenous players in the development of train 7 of LNG. Wow. Why not in the maritime sector?
Okay, sir. Well, I'll still ask the question. I feel that you. What would you say is the reason we've not had? I'm sure you've answered it, but let me just throw it open since it's here. What would you say is the reason commercial banks that attempted? We had two main banks at some point. You know, I remember a lot of people had some vessels. Oh, some people, let me not use the word a lot, had vessels financed by Skybank, Heritage Bank. You know, some have had from First Bank. But we see a situation where banks are very hesitant when it comes to, that's our now local commercial banks here are hesitant when it comes to bad debt, funding. So my question is, how do we move from a place of bad debts in funding maritime infrastructure?
And foremost, the maritime business is very capital intensive. It's very, very technical. I'm wondering if the banks understand, they have desks, officers that understand the sector well enough. That's the first point. They have to have the expertise to be able to interpret the cash flow, to be able to understand the trend of the industry, and then lend against that. That's number one. Number two, just like the energy, oil and gas sector, as soon as something happens, as soon as the global market sneezes, maritime suspend contracts. I don't know the kind of clauses they have there, where they can easily suspend a vessel contract. And as soon as they do that, you don't know for how long. If it's 6 months or beyond, or even 3 months, it can throw the balance sheet of that vessel, of that asset, into a tailspin. It would mean default in loan servicing. It would mean potential bad debts, non-performing loans. So the longer it continues, the worse it is. And unfortunately, I don't think that a lot of the indigenous players have the financial buffer. They don't have the financial buffer to withstand long cancellation, suspension of service, or any disruption. So when those things happen, lender, okay, so hence any bank that wants to tread into that sector has to tread very, very delicately. I mean, that's the nature of business, unfortunately. But when it's going well, it could be quite lucrative. It's quite lucrative for them. All right, so once bitten, twice shy. When that happens, most of them begin to be very ambivalent and very, very unenthusiastic about funding the sector. It's a very capital-intensive sector, a very complex and technical line of business. That's why all the indigenous ship owners and operators are all powerful, strong-willed, men and women. I've never seen any vessel operator or indigenous maritime operator that is a weakling. They're all very strong, very powerful. I totally commend them. I have some of them as my friends, and I respect them a lot. It's a tough business. It can be good when it goes well, but it can also be very, very dicey.
Okay, sir. Besides the sovereignty clauses, should borrowers be wary of when they set out? Are there any that would immediately, raise your hairs once you see them and all that? So for maritime borrowers who are here, what to be wary of?
Yeah, the most critical thing I would advise is to not allow a mismatch between the asset, the operational cash flow, and the terms of the lending.
Yeah.